This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
What do you guys want to talk about?
We've definitely got a wild one coming your way today. We just got done doing the Friday Reformation podcast. Now we're about to shift gears and do the same thing with the Monday show. Only this time, it's WWE exclusive. Or WWF, depending on how you want to view it. I've said I wanted to make some changes with the Monday model for a while, and we're going to start that today. Hopefully people watched last week's show to get a general idea of what we're doing, but in case you need a reminder, and you can't read the title of the video for whatever reason, today we've got the Retro Raw from 1994, WWE SmackDown from Friday night, and a very special classic review series pilot debut, NXT. Specifically NXT from the fall of 2013. One may make the claim it is an all-over-the-map type of show, and you're not entirely wrong, but I think it'll be a good time. I've enjoyed the Retro Raws for what they're worth. SmackDown isn't the most enjoyable program every week, but I get a few things of value out of it. Even if a lot of the show is mostly blasé and sleep-inducing. But I mean, since we've done away with the Collision show, because apparently Saturday is no longer a good night for a fight, no, NXT can surely take its spot. Not NXT 2.0. God, no. Classic NXT, which we will be discussing in Seg 3 of today's show. But before we dive into the fun, make sure you all subscribe, like the video, leave a comment, or 2, or 3, or 4. I don't care. Leave however many comments you want. But show your appreciation for the Five Starr Wrestling Report by coming back every Monday and Friday. We are also on Rumble for those that like secondary platforms. We've been methodically working our way through the archives of a lot of classic wrestling lately. So why not add another one to the mix? It can only be more enjoyable than Wednesday Night Whack-A-Mole that AEW produces every week. Or whatever we're calling Collision. They've collided right off the side of the mountain is what they've done. I mean, they're already making that show the second coming of Rampage. So rather waste my time and hope things will shape up for the better, I'll just pull the plug on it and focus on things that I actually want to talk about. Like Classic Raw from 1994 as an example. Oh, these Retro Raws. What can you really say about them a lot of the time that I haven't already addressed 100 times by now? They're no good. That I think we've clearly established. We did get one great segment on this show, which I'll cover a bit later on. But, yeah, it's kind of the trend with a lot of Retro Raw, isn't it? A couple good things here and there, surrounded by about 30 minutes of blech. I honestly didn't even know how I wanted to segue into this one because the first thing I'm looking at in my notes here is so preposterous on its face. Yet it is a segment that actually aired in the cold open, no less. Tatanka in a suit, gloating about joining the $1 Million Corporation. The man with the former Native American gimmick. The man that used to wear the warrior paint. The man that was once feuding with IRS over a fucking Indian headdress. Now he is showing up on Raw in a limousine, decked out in a custom suit from head to toe. Like he's Ric Flair or one of the Horsemen. Talking about how it is he that sold out for the American dollar. It is so beyond absurd. And by the way, when I stress that line, I am not exaggerating with my delivery. Vince McMahon actually used that phrase while recapping the footage of Luger and Tatanka from SummerSlam. It was he, Tatanka, that sold out for the corporation. Seriously, who the hell says that? Does anyone actually use that in normal day-to-day conversations? It is I that stole your car keys and took it for a joyride. Talk about begging to get punched in the dick. On the subject of Luger and the fallout from all the stuff with him and Tatanka at SummerSlam, well, he appears to be over it. He goes out for his match this week with the Executioner. He's all smiles. He's high-fiving fans. Just totally no-selling the fact that he got screwed in that pay-per-view match. It's sort of the untold story of Lex Luger's entire wrestling career. Getting fed the short end of the stick over and over again. And just trying to put on a happy face like none of it happened. The same Luger that 1 year ago, he was main eventing SummerSlam 93 with the WWF champion Yokozuna, beating him via count out. Now a year later, he's a total nothing burger on this show. Barely a blimp on the radar. Meanwhile, Vince is out there reading all this scripted pro-American patriotism verbiage. I'm just like, dude, fuck off. You pulled the plug on this guy like 9 or 10 months ago, and you're out there preaching like the American spirit of Lex Luger is reigning true. Just fuck off. Seriously. But anyway, Luger won with the rack in like 2 minutes. And then they blow off Pyro while he is standing in the ring posing. I'm just thinking, did I miss the part where they randomly decided to jump back on the Lex Luger bandwagon? Why are we all of a sudden pretending like Vince still cared? Unless we were celebrating Luger's victory over the Executioner, which in that case, I might call that celebration into question a little bit. Dare I say, maybe a little blown out of proportion. Or maybe they were trying to encourage people not to tune out from the show immediately, knowing they were transitioning from that to Jerry Lawler versus Duke the Dumpster Droese, which they set up last week, I believe. Because in addition to Lawler entering a feud with the clowns Doink and Dink, he was also spinning his wheels doing bad underneath comedy with Duke the Dumpster Droese. So, well, before the break, they let him go out there to throw in some verbal jabs. He basically just made a bunch of trash jokes and talked about how Duke smelled like soiled fish and dead skunk. Promised he would take out the trash. Get it? Now, of course, it's Lawler. So the match is a total old-school Memphis-style match. He's bumping around and overselling like crazy for Duke, doing all the heat tactics he can think of, yelling at Hebner to go after Duke for hair pulling and tight grabbing, using closed punches, which I don't think were illegal in the WWF to begin with. And when they come back and do the test of strength deal, Lawler pretends to reach into his singlet to pull out a worked gimmick, and that's how he ends up taking over for the Heat. This is where I wrote down, the genius of Jerry the King Lawler as a worker. The fact that he's getting something this remotely watchable out of Duke the Dumpster in 1994. It's almost too good to be true. And as we approach the final minute, Lawler hits Duke with a sit-out pile driver, at which point he goes out to the floor to grab the conveniently placed garbage can that Duke had left at ringside prior to the match. So as Lawler goes to dramatically lift up the lid, who should pop out but Dink with a squirt gun? I would like to believe he caught Jerry in the eyes with water, but you never know with wrestling. And that leads to Lawler doing the cat and mouse chase with Dink all the way up the aisleway before he gets counted out. Yes, Lawler lost to Duke the Dumpster via count out. Write that one down. And from there, it's more Tom and Jerry skit material with Dink coming back down to bite Lawler in the ass while he's trying to argue with Hebner. They do the tightrope trip spot where Duke picks Lawler's ankle while he's chasing Dink into the ring. And that basically led to Lawler getting run off by Duke, Dink, and eventually Doink. And my final notes for the segment read, somehow, Jerry Lawler took a shit sandwich segment and made it a mildly offensive turd. Take that for what it's worth. I'll say this. You put any other heel in that spot, death television. Like bottom of the barrel levels of bad. But that's what made Jerry Lawler so great. He had a natural ability to get pretty much anything over he was involved with. Even the dirt worst segments. It's probably why they plugged him into this spot. They said, who on our roster could possibly save this from dying a rancid death? How about Lawler? He has a knack for making the best out of virtually anything. God love him. He was a trooper. He put up with a lot of bad shit. And then from there, it's an immediate transition from sports entertainment back to professional wrestling, as we pitch back to the ring for a heavenly body squash with Mike Bell and Stephen King. No, not that Stephen King. It is sort of a generic white name now that you think about it. But, yeah. How about them apples? They trot out the worst kind of WWF comedy from the mid-90s, and then immediately follow that with Dr. Tom and the Gigolo, doing some old-school Southern-style ass-whooping. It was great. Didn't go all that long, granted, but for 3 minutes, I enjoyed it. I especially enjoyed the spot where King attempted to hit a sunset roll-up on Del Rey coming off the ropes. And Del Rey was so gravely offended by this pinfall attempt, he then sprung back up to his feet and decked this fucking guy with a lariat. Damn near took his head off. I thought he all about killed him. Watched that back several times on replay. I laughed harder and harder each time. And then a minute or so later, Jimmy went up top and gave King a moonsault press. Crushed this guy's fucking ribcage on the landing. It was fun. Even without Jim Cornette present, who allegedly was up in Toronto at the time pre-planning for the Heart Attack tour that was more or less kayfabe. I believe his absence stemmed from the Casey O'Connor incident, which was a pretty big scandal around this point in the Smoky Mountain area. I've read that story on The Observer before. It's been years since I went back to read the full article. I'm a little hairy on what exactly happened from start to finish in the timeline, but I've heard Jim recall it on a very early installment of one of his podcasts. Basically the story, and I'm not going to give you a full half-hour description of the entire thing, chapter by chapter. I'm not as good at telling the story as Jim was. But I think it was during a Smoky Mountain Fan Week where the whole thing went down. Casey O'Connor was a former employee that Jim brought in to... I don't even know what the correct term would be. I think he hired him as an office stooge. It's one of those old school wrestling slangs. Basically, Casey was a kid that wanted to get into wrestling, but didn't really have much going for him in terms of a look or anything. But he was a fan. He'd been around the Smoky Mountain area for a while. Jim knew him. He was heavily active in the fan fest and all the big events. So he got an office job. Some to whet his appetite and keep him involved without necessarily being on camera. And so the story goes, he was around for a while. Things weren't happening. Tasks weren't getting completed properly. Management was complaining. Sandy Scott in particular. And eventually Corny got fed up with him. So he fired him. And those two had a falling out for a period. So fast forward in the time machine, there's something that comes up involving a camcorder that Cornette had loaned to Casey, oddly enough. And he realized that he never got it back. So he calls up Casey one day while he's at his apartment complex or wherever he was in Beckley, West Virginia. And he's trying to get the video cam back, but Casey is holding him up for money that he believes Cornette still owed him from previous work he had done in the office job before he got fired. So you can pretty much see where the story escalates. And, well, newsflash, it doesn't end well. Corny had given him several warnings via phone call that he was coming over because he already knew where he lived. It wasn't like he had to go out of his way to hunt his address down. And if Casey didn't give his camcorder back to him, he would whip out a baseball bat and go to town on his car. Skip ahead to the last chapter. Corny did the deed. And he ends up getting arrested and booked at the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office, I believe it was, which he already knew was going to happen anyway. That's why he decided not to drive home afterwards, because he was smart enough to know what was going to happen. And, I forget all the costs for damages. It was somewhere in the ballpark of $800 to $1,000's worth of damage to the car. I think he posted bail for somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000. In the end, they wind up getting back on good terms. Although it took a little longer than a 48-hour turnaround. Time heals all wounds, I guess. Most men are pretty simple, though. You tend to get over petty shit a lot faster. And normally if you give it time and have a beer or two, those issues tend to resolve themselves. It's, again, I don't purport to be a story expert on the matter. I'm just going by rote. I do vaguely remember the Casey O'Connor incident from September of 94, but context is always key. And again, whose side of the story are you getting? The truth always lies somewhere in the middle of those news bulletins. It's always entertaining hearing Cornette recount the stories, though, because he has such a fascinating delivery to where you're just totally immersed into what he's saying, even if it's not the full picture. But, yeah, that was my Cliff's Notes rundown of the Casey O'Connor incident. Probably sounds a lot better when Jim tells it. So now that we've addressed the interesting matter for this week's Retro Raw, let us proceed with the rest of the show. It's like AEW. The backstage stuff is always more entertaining than the on-screen product. Well, we did get some rather unintentional comedy with the next segment with Bob Backlund and Vince McMahon. We actually had quite a few remarkable moments here. As I refer back to my notes, this may have been one of the better Raw angles we've seen in a long time. Because boy, did it escalate quickly by the end. So Vince is interviewing Backlund, talking about his comeback to the World Wrestling Federation and the sudden change in attitude upon his arrival, noting that he's developed quite a reputation for having lost his mind. He snapped. To which the Macho Man, in perfect Slim Jim commercial voice, goes, "Snapped!" And as Vince then follows up by asking, "What is going on in your head, Mr. Backlund?" Savage, deadpan, responds with, "Nothing." I laughed. Made better by the fact that as Backlund is trying to explain that he's coming off having celebrated his 16th year anniversary as WWF champion, now going on 18, he bumbles over himself trying to get out that line. So Savage retorts with, "So messed up in his head he can't even count." Savage was in rare form in this segment. But of course, the anniversary celebration is funny enough because Backlund is still under the impression that he is the rightful WWF champion. An ongoing story in the WWF that had been going on for years. And we talked about Backlund's gimmick when he returned to the WWF in 94. The crazy old man that lost his temper and just killed people on a whim, losing control of his emotions. And this fucking promo he did. God, was it great. Standing there running down all the uneducated people in the audience. I believe he referred to them as plebeians, which is almost as good as Lawler calling the people peons, saying that if American people weren't so fat and lazy, we could live in a utopian society. He says that when he came back to the WWF, he wanted to be a man of the people. But since nobody holds American values anymore, since they can't meet his high standards of what it means to be an American citizen, oh, screw them. He calls everybody weak and dyslexic, saying that 50% of the population can't even read. Talking about the broken education system. Says he doesn't want to live in a society surrounded by completely inept human beings. And finally, it all leads to Backlund saying that his chicken wing hold is so lethal and so devastating, if anyone were to break it, then he would leave the WWF for good. So as Vince goads him into challenging somebody from the locker room to come out and try and break the chicken wing hold, Backlund calls in then WWF magazine writer Lou Gianfrido which was not a work, by the way. Lou was an actual WWF magazine writer back in the mid-90s. I believe he was a Stamford resident, or somewhere in the general area of where WWE headquarters ended up being. And of course, he gets in the ring. They acknowledge that he and Backlund are good friends, but I mean, visually, it's a total mismatch. Louis like fucking 5'6" at most. Probably 130 pounds soaking wet. So as you'd expect, this does not bode well for poor Lou. Backlund locks on that chicken wing, and he's jerking this poor guy around like he's nothing. Vince is begging for Backlund to let go of the hold. And as Backlund pulls him down to the ground and keeps the hold applied, here come referees and eventually Savage to come pry Backlund off of him. And it's a very heat-centric angle they shot here. You know, the referees get Lou out to the floor. Vince and Savage are looking on disgusted with Backlund, showing no remorse for what he did. And then he gets on the mic afterwards and claims that he is now Mr. Backlund. And this is what real discipline is about. And my final conclusion for this segment reads, what a great old school classic cartoon villain that Bob Backlund was. He was so brilliant in this segment. I can't get over how awesome he was. Well, everyone was awesome here. Who am I kidding? Backlund was great. Vince was great. Savage was great. Everybody. They all worked their roles perfectly. You know, it's one of those things where you look back and you're like, how is this not edgy for television in 1994? Lawler gets in trouble for smashing a gimmick trash can over Duke the Dumpster's head, but Backlund can go out there and choke out a dude in front of God and everybody, and that's permissible? That's crazy. Talk about borderline content. This segment, it was definitely out of the realm of what you would expect on WWF television during this time. I loved it, though. This totally would have fit in with something on Mid-South or Memphis or Crockett. Like, you name the promotion, Florida, Dallas. Doesn't matter what territory we're talking about. Like I said, it was very counterculture to what WWF was producing at the time. But it totally worked. They were on a mission to get Backlund over as an unhinged lunatic. Maybe oil mechanic Moxley would benefit from watching some Bob Backlund segments from '94. Learn how to be an actual crazy guy that people don't openly mock and call bullshit on. And instead of preaching about drinking the bones and eating the blood of his opponents, how about you try going for something a little more realistic? Something more believable. I mean, imitating Bob Backlund is far from the worst thing Moxley could do. Anything is better than what he's currently doing. I mean, that should have been the end of the show right there. Because everything else that followed was just placeholder material. The quintessential definition of a standby match. We go from that to a spark plug Bob Holly squash with Richie Rich. I wish I were making that up. That had to be the ultimate rib. Following one of the best segments of 1994 with fucking Bob Holly in his stupid neon green ring attire. Ridiculous. I don't even know what the hell happened here. Holly won with a diving body press. Vince was completely disengaged, coming off that Backlund segment. And who could blame him? I mean, he all but said, sorry, folks. Hate to throw the young guy under the bus here, but nobody gives a shit about this match. And he wasn't wrong. Nor did anybody really care about Yokozuna versus Phil Apollo in the main event. Vince and Savage blatantly going out of their way to make fat jokes. Did I hear Vince make a Twinkie reference here in 1994? When did Hostess create that snack? Was it the 50s? No, maybe it was a bit sooner than that. Guess it wasn't totally untimely. I mean, as expected, Yoko killed the guy. In about every sense of the word. Bonsai drop, 1, 2, 3. And then afterwards, the lights dimmed to a very ominous red setting. My first thought was, oh, so Kane debuted that soon, huh? And then I remember that wasn't until like 97. No, it was indeed The Undertaker playing mind games. Because, yeah, they were building to that casket rematch. Yippee skippy. Looking forward to that. But really nothing much else to say about the match. Yoko's only getting bigger every time we see him. By now, I wouldn't be surprised if he was pushing 7 bills. It's sad. It really is. I mean, he was still mobile, but you could definitely tell the health decline was growing more substantially. I mean, really, if you think about it, he only had about a couple years left before they pulled the plug on him. And he was gone. I mean, Vince clearly gave up with the push by now. That was apparent. But it's still crazy to think they kept him around for as long as they did. I mean, even by now, you could tell he was very unmotivated. It's always one of those things where you look into a story like that and it just fills you with disappointment. But those final 2 segments were only going to pale in comparison to the Backlund angle. That still might go down as one of the best Raw moments in 1994, period. And you know what's funny? I had no memory of that ever happening. It was just kind of a throwaway heat angle on a random Raw episode. Yeah, they're trying to build up the Bret Hart-Bob Backlund feud, setting up that abrupt title switch later on. But with the way they laid it out, God, you'd have thought Backlund was in for the push of a lifetime. Like we were going all the way back to the 70s. When in actuality, he was really only being set up to be a transitional champion so they could flip-flop the belt onto Nash in like 2 months. It's amazing. They used a legendary Bob Backlund segment as a plot device to get over Kevin Nash. No, it wouldn't be the first time a wrestling company would fuck up something great to try to get over Kevin Nash. Reference: Bill Goldberg. Need I say more? That Nash title run is coming up a lot sooner than I thought, too. I am absolutely dreading next year. How in God's name am I going to get through WWF in 1995? There was so much bad shit that happened that year. One of the single worst years in company history, bar none. By the grace of God, we'll get through it. For now, guess we'll move on to SmackDown. And that was a hell of a show. They really went above and beyond with the star power this week, didn't they? I mean, I guess you had to figure the first SmackDown under the Endeavor umbrella. The TKO merger is official. WWE and UFC are now one multi-billion-dollar conglomeration, figuring they wanted to capitalize on all the company publicity surrounding that deal, be it good or bad publicity. They really pulled out all the stops this week with the name power. I mean, in terms of the show formatting, it was more or less status quo when it comes to SmackDown. But this did have some Vince McMahon fingerprints on it, where something big is happening in the company, so in an effort to hotshot some angles on TV to keep the buzz stirring, you just throw out every major name you can possibly get your hands on and hope it draws in some casual eyeballs. The question is, did it work? I have not checked the SmackDown ratings, but I can only assume they popped a number, considering who showed up. I mean, normally you would get guys like, well, the ones you would normally expect. Roman Reigns, John Cena, as we saw here in the opener of the show, Pat McAfee was there. But I was not expecting that other big name. That was very much out of left field. But boy, did it stir up some conversation. It was a good reminder to any young fan watching today's product. Yeah, this is what real star power used to look like in the WWF. Friendly reminder. And we'll talk about him later on. Well, actually, we'll talk about him here in the opening segment. And for the record, I'm not going to go into detail about the merger thing, beyond the fact that I'm not really qualified to talk about how it affects the insider business trading or the stock market. And I think most people have already brought this up in some way, shape, or form. The TKO merger doesn't appear to be impacting the on-screen product in any major capacity, at least for the foreseeable future. I mean, that could easily change depending on how hands-on Vince wants to get now that he's back in a main role. One thing people are mentioning lately is the potential for mass employee layoffs. And this is something WWE's been through the ringer with before. You know, we've seen the mass exodus of talent over the years. It used to sort of be a given that every year, normally it would be like the night or the week after WrestleMania, as we would approach the summer period. I mean, they'd be letting go of like 15 to 20 people at a given time. A lot of the releases would be underneath guys or people that weren't in very instrumental roles behind the scenes, whether it's talent agenting or marketing or producing or whatever their position was. As of now, I haven't read any articles about specific names that have been let go. I'm sure we'll start to hear about it in the coming week or two. Should we read more into it? Maybe. I guess it kind of depends on who gets cut. I mean, if it's like 50% of the current NXT roster, I don't think anybody's going to lose sleep over it. If it's guys that are in big featured spots on TV right now, well, that's another conversation. I heard they brought Nia Jax back on Raw this past week. Yeah. That brought signs of hope and joy to everybody watching. Well, anyway, why don't we get into this thing and see what SmackDown had in store for this week? What groundbreaking moments were captured on today's program? Well, for starters, Pat McAfee is back. I mentioned that a minute ago. And he's out there talking about how he was in the area when he decided to drop by because he knew SmackDown was in Denver. And while he's doing the whole white meat babyface deal, here comes Austin Theory, wearing the exact same ring attire, essentially, as Pat was here. Black tank top, black pants, sneakers, and they're doing some casual back and forth here for a while. Theory's getting a ton of heat on himself, talking about how when he comes out in a black tank top with his physique, he actually looks like a star. Pat wearing the same shirt just looks like you ought to be flipping fries. He is now calling this the Austin Theory Live Show. Says that he's the heart and soul of SmackDown, blah, blah. And right as Pat goes, no, Austin, this is not your show. This is the People's Show. And you know what that means. Well, we certainly found out what that meant. Because who should then come down to the ring but The Rock? The Rock. The one and only. And by golly, does that man know how to command attention in a room. How long has it been since we've seen The Rock in WWE? 4 or 5 years? He doesn't miss a beat. He's got these people eating out of the palm of his hand. Comes down, takes his time getting into the ring, milking that reaction for all it's worth. This is where I wrote down, John Cena wishes he could generate that kind of reaction. And as he gets in the ring and stands toe-to-toe with Theory, this is also where I wrote down, holy shit, I forgot how ginormous The Rock was. We'll talk about how much he's bulked up in the last few years, but just seeing him tower over Austin Theory, who, mind you, is not a small man. Like, Theory's got to be at least, 6 foot, 6'1"? Rock is a tall man. And of course, we're all just waiting to hear him roast this guy on the microphone. So as Theory tries to immediately badmouth Rock out of the gate, all Rock has to say is, and I quote, "Shut your bitch ass up." That was it. That was all he said. And the people popped like it was the greatest thing they had ever heard in a ring. Of course, there's McAfee in the corner marking out the whole time. Literally like a fan. He didn't even try to hide it. He's just standing there soaking it in. Probably the highlight of his wrestling career up to this point. And this is where Rock took off his jacket to show his massive biceps. He's clearly been hitting the TRT. And the weights, but most definitely the TRT. And no, he does his shtick. Finally, The Rock has come back to Denver. I did not do a very good impression of that. Let me try that again. Finally, The Rock has come back to Denver. And Theory immediately tries to butt in by saying that, unlike Stone Cold, the real Austin is in the ring, standing toe-to-toe with the Gray One. And as Rock tries to respond by saying, well, actually, The Rock thinks, bam! Theory immediately cuts him off and goes, it doesn't matter what The Rock thinks. Which I think legitimately cracked The Rock, because either he did not see that line coming, or he knew it was coming, but he still couldn't help but laugh. And, I mean, there's so much to this. I could be here for an hour if I wanted to. The main premise is this. Rock was a genius for getting virtually anything over, up to and including the corny catchphrases and all the childish insults. All of that shit still sticks. Like I said, he has not lost a beat. He got the entire arena to chant, "You're an asshole," to Theory for like 3 straight minutes. The fans completely hijacked the show so they could call Austin Theory an asshole, which I imagine the production team was having a wondrous time trying to censor that. Rock definitely won them over by the end of this. And eventually Theory tried to throw in a cheap shot at Rocky, but Rock blocked him, gave him the great spine buster, milked the fuck out of that people's elbow, and then he let McAfee get one in as well for extra reinforcement. I mean, if we learned anything from last year's WrestleMania, Austin Theory is a heck of a bumping machine. So he was bound to get this over like $1 million. This was, I mean, what do you say? Definitely a segment of the year contender, no doubt. In a vacuum, there wasn't much to talk about in terms of the actual delivery. It was Rock making Austin Theory look like a jackass because, well, it's easy to make Austin Theory look like a jackass. But it's definitely got a lot of people talking in the last 48 hours alone. I mean, we saw Rock in one other segment on the show, but now the gears are starting to turn a little bit for people. Like, you're just starting to think, the guy's in good shape. He's been working out. If they brought him back for this show, chances are they have something pre-planned for him. You know, what exactly it is or what it's leading to, that's yet to be seen. You probably would expect something with him and Roman. That's been in the works for a couple years now. Things just hadn't worked out in Rock's schedule because of how busy he's been, but God, it was a phenomenal segment. Rock. He's still The Rock. You know, facially you can see the age, but he's still a megastar. He's a bigger star than anybody in today's business, that's for sure. And he's been part-time for the last 21 or 22 years. You listen to reactions like the one he got here, and you come to recognize this is how the shows used to be every week. This is the level of star power we were talking back in the 90s. During the height of the Monday Night Wars, these kinds of reactions were piercing through the arenas every week. Regardless of how good or bad the product was at the time, when Rock's music hit, you knew he meant business. When the glass shattered and Steve Austin was coming out, people reacted like this. And I think the reason this works so well is that nobody was expecting it. You know, and especially in today's business where word travels fast, things are spoiled so easily. I mean, you can't hide anything. They sure hid this. Did anybody expect Rock to show up this week? I sure didn't. In Colorado, of all places. That was probably the best part of it. The fact that nobody saw it coming. Like, that's the kind of shock factor that's missing in today's product. Genuine shock. Because fans were not expecting a famous star to return or some new name to show up. I mean, they've already made SmackDown must-see purely based on The Rock showing up alone. And again, he wasn't the only thing on the show we're talking about, because there's other stuff to dive into. But what does the future hold for The Rock? The possibilities are endless. Hopefully not a third match with John Cena, because I don't think we need to see that. But man, you look at him with the conditioning he's in. Yeah, they got something in store. What a great moment, though. Great segment. Great back and forth banter. Theory getting that kind of rub. Like, that's something you ought to be proud of, man. Yeah, he got laid out by The Rock. But just the fact that they let him go toe-to-toe with the guy, that's nothing to scoff at. They could have given that spot to anybody else on the roster. but they chose Austin Theory. That's quite a crowning achievement. You know, especially with Theory coming off that big segment with Stone Cold in the previous year. The stuff with him and McAfee facing John Cena at this year's WrestleMania. It's really amazing to think about. Like, you watch the way he's booked on television, so often you think, why do they intentionally go out of their way to make this guy look like an idiot? But then you think about the guys he's faced in just the last 2 years. Steve Austin, Pat McAfee, John Cena, and now The Rock. The stuff with him and Vince, too, you can't forget that. It's like all this name power they're shoehorning him in. And then I'm watching him job out to Rey Mysterio on a filler pay-per-view in the middle of the card less than 4 weeks ago. It's like, what the hell are we doing here? So that was that. And then somehow they had about 40 minutes, give or take, to try to follow that. Try as they might with Finn Balor versus AJ Styles. It did not top the opening segment with The Rock. But it was a good match. You know, the commercials always ruin any possibility of me getting fully invested because it just breaks up the flow of everything. But they got about 8 minutes. Crowd was still hot coming off the previous segment, so they were into it. And they built to a spot where AJ caught Balor with a fireman's carry neckbreaker. Balor rolled out to the floor, but AJ caught him with a springboard forearm. They had the Judgment Day run interference while AJ was trying to set up for the phenomenal forearm on the apron. But as Priest went to sweep the leg of AJ, the referee caught him and ejected both him and Dirty Dom. And while those guys were jaw-jacking, here comes Jimmy Uso in the back door to distract AJ. And then Balor caught him with the crucifix pin and stole the victory. I mean, it was more so about the angles in the actual match, but I kind of talked about it last week. Having the Judgment Day on SmackDown as an integral part of the story arc, it's not a bad thing. The Bloodline's been stale for a long time. They were teasing the thing with with them in the Judgment Day last week. Jimmy Uso being the difference maker in the end. I mean, it does leave you wondering how far they're going to go with the whole supergroup heel alliance thing. Wouldn't have been my first choice for taking the Bloodline in a new story direction, but and they certainly could do worse. A lot of it does seem like placeholder stuff to get them through either the next pay-per-view or even Survivor Series. I don't know how much steam the whole Judgment Day Bloodline alliance has at this stage, especially when Jimmy Uso is sort of in the leading role. And they got the thing with Jey Uso on Raw, too. And we're yet to see how he factors into anything. I mean, they're building to something, but I don't know if it's very clear-cut yet. I mean, they sort of alluded to the Usos joining up with the Judgment Day a couple of segments later when Balor was talking to Jimmy backstage and trying to convince him to get Jey on board. He talked about how the cool thing is with the Judgment Day is that there are no leaders. So if the Usos join, they would have free reign to make their own choices. And now that actually got Jimmy thinking for a hot sec. I think he was more so scouting the tag belts that Balor had on his shoulder, but maybe that's me reading too much into it. Oh yeah, and then Paul Heyman walked up like the split frame before they cut back to the ring, which was very odd. Apparently it was very important that we pitch back to the ring, though, for a Street Profits LWO tag match. Yeah, we couldn't hear what Paul Lee was telling Jimmy backstage because we had to go back to the ring for this match. And it's not even like the Street Profits were wrestling Rey and Escobar. No, they were wrestling the LWO Flunkies. Whatever their names are. Joaquin Wilde and Hector Dominguez. I also still have no fucking clue what they're doing with Bobby Lashley and the Street Profits, but I can now confidently say it has officially been 1 week. I'm kind of over it. I still have no idea whether they're babyfaces or heels. I don't even think the writers know, if we're being honest. And apparently the match was such a waste of time that they went to commercial during the Street Profits intro. The entire match pretty much happened during the break. So they come back, they wrestle for about a minute, and then the Profits hit some kind of wacky double team combo for the pin. A double A spinebuster neckbreaker combo. I don't even know what you would call that. More effort than it's worth. That's what I would call it. But then Lashley and the Profits jumped the LWO after the bell, so I guess that answers my question. They are apparently heels. Well, good. Glad we got that cleared up. And then from there, we go to our top of the hour match. I believe they announced this last week when LA Knight confronted Adam Pearce in his office, demanding the rematch with him and The Miz. Even though LA Knight, the babyface, got the clean victory over the heel Miz at the Payback special. WWE logic, the feud must continue. And if you recall my pay-per-view recap, I talked about the match. It was fine. Like nothing you were going to remember 5 weeks after it happened, but it was harmless enough. The end result was what mattered most. So they had their rematch, even though it's completely unwarranted. And again, it was fine. It was okay. I don't think the fans were as into it as they were the first go-around. And even a lot of the LA Knight pops were more subdued compared to normal. Everything they did was very basic. Nothing offensive. Miz cut off Knight before the break. Knight got the fire up at the end. He did the mud hole stomp kicks in the corner. Everybody chanted, "Yeah!" which was funny. And it's some more back and forth stuff at the end. And then Knight just sort of hit BFT from out of nowhere and won. Again, right result. The match was kind of whatever. But I talked about it before with LA Knight. Yeah, they're letting him rack up some wins. But at least they're consistent now. It's not a matter of them throwing him a bone so he could win a TV match and then he jobs out for the next 3 weeks in a row. No, he's winning consistently. The fans are behind the gimmick. He's still in a featured part of the show every week. These are all good things. They shot the thing with him and Cena at the pay-per-view, so he's obviously being factored into something big for later on. Where it goes, we'll have to see. And he got some promo time afterwards, which he needed. Basically just reaffirming his mission statement that he's on the hunt for gold. And he doesn't care who it is. Babyface or heel, mid-card champion or main event champion. LA Knight won't stop until he climbs the top of the mountain and dethrones every top champion in WWE. At which point, they end up cutting to the locker room to show Paulie and Solo looking on through the monitor. And, of course, Solo's gearing up to take the fight tonight, since he threatened the tribal chief, indirectly or not. But, of course, Heyman's all about standards and practices, so he's trying to encourage Solo not to engage until Roman gives the order, which is so fucking brilliant on its face. The idea that Paul Heyman is such a slimeball, he can't even bark orders on his own without having to consult his higher power. He has to get approval from Roman for everything. because he's such a weasel, he won't even have the balls to call his own shots. I love Paul Heyman. He's so fucking great. But, well, Solo leaves the room and says he's going to do it anyway. And then Paul looked on very concerned. I still think Solo ought to be a mute. Every time I hear him open his mouth, his voice, God, his voice, it does not match the look at all. There's no bass. Like, you know what I mean? You listen to him talk, he just sounds like a 20-something-year-old kid straight out of college. It's like prepubescent Solo Sikoa. It's crazy. Because you look at him, you're like, that's a man's man. And then hear him talk, and you're like, what the fuck? Is that the same guy? Sure is. So, well, to be continued with that. What else do we have here? I'll talk about the women's match in a sec. There was something with Pretty Deadly in the back that I skipped over because, well, see the parties involved. The polar opposite of men's men. I think that was the only thing I skipped over now that I look back. I take it I didn't miss anything important. So then we had Bayley and Asuka. They certainly had a match of some description. It was a thing that existed on the show. Got really messy toward the last few minutes where they were just sort of meandering through the motions and honestly, I don't even know what the hell they were trying to do. Just mistiming everything in the book. But they end up rolling out to the floor so they could do an angle where Bajzi appears from behind the barricade. Confirmed. She no longer has green hair. It is now short and spiked up. She now looks like a human porcupine. And this frightened Bayley to the point where she slid back into the ring and Asuka caught her in a backslide pin for the 3 count. I wrote down, didn't these two have a heated feud in NXT at one point that was like one of the featured matches on a TakeOver special? Well, now Asuka is just pinning Bayley on television in 9 minutes via run and distraction spots from a 5-foot, 100-pound girl in goth gear. Apparently that feud is still going on, though. Doesn't change my opinion of Shotzi one way or another. Whether it's short hair, long hair, she still sucks. They can give her a total makeover from head to toe. Her matches are always going to be the shits. But whatever. It's not my hill to die on. I'm actually shocked I had the patience to sit through that. I mean, for 10 minutes, wasn't the worst thing I've ever seen with the women on television. But, far from the most compelling. And speaking of things that were far from compelling, the main event this week. I repeat everything I've said 100 million times when it comes to Grayson Fodder on this show. My opinion still stands. I don't get it. I'll never get it. This bland-ass, boring, uncharismatic, vanilla-looking job guy with the personality of rotting tree bark and this lame-ass talk show he does. Yet somehow, this fucking goofball is getting booked all over the show like he's a somebody. Despite the fact that his win-loss record is laughable, he's never had one major defining career moment to date. Now they got him interacting and going face-to-face with guys like John Cena, thinking that he's a somebody when nothing can be further from the truth. So, of course, the gag is that Fodder won't let Cena get a word in edgewise, constantly getting in the way of Cena's promo time, mocking him for being a shitty guest host at Payback, saying he doesn't have it anymore as a wrestler and that he's looking for an excuse to hang up the boots and everybody knows it. And right as Cena goes to take off the ball cap and the t-shirt, revealing that glorious shining wonder on the back of his cranium. Okay, real talk for a sec. Why not just shave the head? John Cena has had the buzz cut before. What movie is he currently starring in to where he needs a full head of hair? I'm just asking. So anyway, here comes Jimmy Uso, and he immediately takes the mic from John, tells him that he ain't gonna do jack shit right now, and unless he's here to prove him wrong, he can get out of Usi's ring. He didn't actually say Usi, but I figured people would appreciate that. Anyhow, here comes Solo, flanked by Paul, and he gets in the ring to immediately confront Cena, and they go for the intentional swerve, where we're supposed to think that Solo is going to jump Jimmy, but it is Cena that eats the super kick. And while they're putting the boots to Cena in the corner, cue AJ Styles for the run-in. And, well, that basically sends the heels powdering. Cena goes for the AA on Jimmy, but Solo saves him. And apparently, the feud that we thought they were building to between Fodder and Theory versus Cena and LA Knight, well, now they appear to be going in a completely different direction. For whatever reason, they are now teasing Cena and AJ going up against Solo and Jimmy. Okay. Sure. I mean, it is another big name they're throwing in there to work with some of the mainstays. Again, I'm not all that enthralled with the stuff they've been doing with Solo and Jimmy on television. Just the whole Jimmy Uso singles push period. I haven't been a fan. They're trying to rack up some curiosity with the Judgment Day involvement. They were conspicuously left out of the equation here, which was interesting. I just thought it was funny during all this fucking pandemonium happening in the ring. Meanwhile, there's Grayson Fodder just sitting in his chair, not batting an eyelash, just watching it all unfold like it's nothing. Talk about being a total afterthought. His own talk show. Complete non-entity by the end. Just like everything with Grayson Fodder on this show. Total non-factor. I mean, on general principle, I don't think I would have closed SmackDown with that. I don't know. It's one of those segments where, compared to the Rock stuff we just saw in the opener, it's a night and day segment. And I know it's an unfair comparison, but still. In its own unique way, though, this will probably wind up being one of the more memorable SmackDowns of the entire year. Even if everything following the Rock segment was sort of an afterthought. Like, you see him out there. It's Rock in a WWE ring for the first time in several years. People aren't going to forget that. It won't rank among the top Rock segments of all time. But in today's era, good Lord. That might end up being one of the top 5 wrestling moments of the entire year. If not top 3. And again, I like how they're leaving the door open for options. We don't know what to expect with The Rock now that he's back. This can't be a one-off appearance. I don't buy that for a second. But then again, there was no mention of anything with him and Roman. no mention of anything with him in the bloodline. They kept it pretty hush-hush. So they're not immediately jumping in with both feet. We'll see where it all goes. Until next time, as we continue to layeth thee smacketh down with these Monday podcasts, I guess. But for the time being, we're about ready to enter a new era of the FSWR channel. It's taken AEW approximately 1 week to completely kill the steam of their Saturday Collision show. Could have called that one in my sleep. Didn't even have to give it a second chance. I knew that as soon as Punk was gone and Tony was left to his own devices, that show was eventually going to spiral its way into the toilet. Lo and behold, I've heard some reports on the previous couple Saturday Collision shows. They are not looking too promising. So with me thinking about 3 steps ahead of the curb, I decided to do some hunting on the WWE Network, or Peacock, whatever we're calling it now. And I talked about it in the lead up to this report. My goal was to try to find a suitable replacement for the Collision reviews, while still trying to stay in the ballpark of WWE-related content. We've already got the WWF Retro Raws we're reviewing. SmackDown on Friday nights is a workable enough 2 hours for me. So, as I was browsing on The Cock, seeing what content was available out there for viewing pleasure, I guess you could say I was struck with a sudden urge to take a peek back through the NXT library. It's something that, actually, now that I think of it, I don't know if any other current podcasters or wrestling personalities are doing any kind of NXT retro deep dive. It's not to say NXT was the second coming of WCW, but I'm old enough to remember that there was a long stretch in like the mid-2010s when NXT was all the rage. People were talking about it. It was a hot product. Modern fans were so disenfranchised with main roster WWE, everybody sort of jumped aboard the NXT bandwagon. Mostly in the sense that they knew Vince wasn't very hands-on with the product at the time. They were all so tired of the bullshit they were being fed with main roster product. Raw, SmackDown, whatever was going on at the time. The people were so desperate for a viable alternative. AEW didn't exist by that point. Ring of Honor and Impact were kind of what they were. So the people found a little niche product. They were seeing what Hunter was doing while operating and overseeing the NXT model. And for whatever reason, people took to it. And I sort of explained it last week. My goal with picking NXT was to try to find a middle ground when it came to reviewing classic content. Because, I'm not going to watch the current NXT program. I already tried that experiment. That lasted all of about 2 months before I canned it. But I did see a decent amount of stuff with the old black and gold brand of NXT from 2013 to about 2019 or 2020. Somewhere in that window. At the point I really started investing in the show weekly, they had already been running internationally with the takeover shows. They were gaining a lot of traction with the hardcores. And we'll certainly get into more detail about my thoughts on the future direction NXT would go. Once they broke away from the old developmental model and basically turned it into a better version of Ring of Honor. And I explained why I decided to start in 2013 as opposed to going all the way back to 2010 when NXT first came about. The old Tough Enough rip-off format, God, that was a complete disaster. Those shows sucked, and I don't think anybody would deny that. And while they did get a few diamonds in the rough to come out of that beginning system, and it did lead to some interesting angles on the main roster with the Nexus, trust me when I tell you, it's not worth me suffering through 2 years of reviewing those beginning shows just to get to a failed crossover experiment with a bunch of rookies, where the end result is, shock of all shocks, Lol Cena wins. Who didn't see that coming? Cena going out there and burying the entire fucking Nexus in one pay-per-view event. And while there was the FCW era right before NXT completely took over, my earliest memories of watching NXT for the first time was, again, somewhere around that late 2013 or early 2014 time frame. I'd seen bits and pieces of the developmental product beforehand, but I wasn't really tuned in every single week. So I figured it would be the best place to start. It's right before NXT took off and started getting really big. It's around the point WWE was going on the indie purge and stealing away all the top talent from across the globe. You know, whether it was Owens and Zayn from Ring of Honor, Balor from New Japan, a couple bigger names from Impact. I think they picked up Drew McIntyre later on after he had spent several years on the indie circuit rebuilding his career. I mean, there's a lot that happened in just that 4 or 5 year window. You know, of course, all the stuff that happened once those guys got caught up to the main roster later on, which is a sad state of affairs for the majority of those talents. It'll become the common thread as we run down this show in a few minutes and look back at who actually benefited from working in NXT before getting called up to the main roster. That was actually one of the first long-form podcasts I did here on the channel when I came back after that 2-year hiatus. Go back and listen to that show for reference. I did a lot of research for that show, where I ran down every single NXT call-up from like 2012 to 2021, I think it was at the time. And I talked about if they lost or gained traction after leaving NXT. Were they more or less over with the crowd after the fact? It's a fascinating discussion, and very eye-opening in a lot of ways. But I've been really looking forward to this. A sort of blast from the past, if you will. So without further ado, let us get into our first classic NXT report. And the date, keep in mind I'm starting with this specific show to keep within the timeline of the retro dates. We're now in September, so it's fitting that we start here with the September 18th edition of NXT. A 43-minute episode, by the way. This was still at the point where the NXT shows were only about an hour in runtime. Take out any infomercials, which I am certainly not going to complain about with my current schedule. An hour-long wrestling show is much easier to digest than 2 or 3, at least for the kind of patience I have anymore. And boy, just going back and watching that opening montage alone, there's a 45-minute conversation in that one little window. All those names that fly out of the screen. It's so interesting when you go back and see the young blood up-and-comers back from 2013. Sami Zayn, Xavier Woods, Bo Dallas. God, I'll talk about him in a while. Talk about ancient history. I think I saw Corey Graves on there. This was still when he was wrestling on the show before he had to retire due to all the concussion issues. Adrian Neville, the former Pac. Remember how big of a push that guy got? Oh man, they have such babyface looks. Like these super young, facially clean-looking dudes. So weird going back and remembering who they were putting through the ringer at the time. The guys and gals that they were viewing as the future prospects of the business. And how so many of them fell through. I'll tell you who didn't fall through, though, was Sami Zayn. He was a rare gem. He truly was. All those stars. Here he is in 2013. the short haircut, the semi-El Generico-inspired ring gear, just remove the mask. It's crazy to think. At the point WWE signed him to a developmental contract, Sami Zayn literally just got off the indie circuit wrestling as El Generico in Ring of Honor. A masked mute who never spoke and did flippy gymnastic moves like so many other guys did at the time. Who would have ever thought that guy, this dude, would somehow wind up becoming one of the most over talents in NXT and main roster WWE in the modern decade? And imagine that. All they had to do was take the fucking mask off of him and let him be a personality on camera. I wonder who made that judgment call. Cough, cough, Dusty. It's actually very timely now that I reflect back on it. This was 2013. Sami was one of the hottest talents in NXT at this point. This was when they were running with him as the underdog babyface, and he was on the pursuit of the World Championship, trying to win the big one. You know, that slow, methodical plot development they ran with him for almost an entire year. And then you fast forward 10 years later. Who'd have thought this same guy would end up being one of the most over guys on main roster television, alongside the Bloodline? I mean, Sami has got to be one of the biggest NXT accomplishments in their entire history, right? I mean, he's had some rough patches over the years with main roster WWE. I don't think they ever fully capitalized on that hot streak when they first called him up. You know, he had that match with John Cena on Raw in like 2014 or 2015 where he dislocated his shoulder, and that kind of sidelined him for a while. Then he kind of got shoehorned into mid-card purgatory for so long. Like, if you really think about it for a minute, how long did it take Sami to dig himself out of the trenches after basically toiling around for years on main roster WWE? 5 or 6? That's a long time. But he stuck the course. He didn't quit. And that road to redemption really kind of started with the Bloodline, didn't it? I mean, he was a mid-card champion on and off, but if you really look back at Sami's track record after he left NXT, did they ever do anything with him? I can't think of much. Probably had 16 gazillion matches with Kevin Owens, because, I mean, that was kind of the gimmick. But what else? He was just a guy. And then one day on TV, they shot the angle with him confronting the Bloodline in the locker room, and well, the rest is history, isn't it? But getting back to this show, Sami was out in the opener wrestling Curt Hawkins. There's a name that probably hasn't been mentioned in eons. Curt Hawkins. Boy, does that bring back some memories. Whatever happened to Curt Hawkins? Wasn't he in a tag team with Zack Ryder at one point? Another name that people probably haven't talked about in a hot minute. Better known as Matt Cardona, if you're an NWA fan, I guess. Is he still with the NWA? I don't even know at this point. It was a really nice match, though. God, you watch Sami out there, and it's like, he really is kind of an amazing specimen. I mean, you look at his conditioning for one, and you're like, that dude's never worked out a day in his life. But damn, his shit looked good. He was so fluid with the basics. His arm drags look great. His drop kicks look fantastic. I mean, he's always been a hell of an athlete, despite how plain his body looked. That's not even mentioning the facials and the selling. It's why it always astounded me when I learned that they took the mask off of him in WWE and made him Sami Zayn. They killed the El Generico gimmick, and I was like, holy shit, this guy's great. The hell didn't they do this with him for the past 10 years in Ring of Honor? And if I would have gotten the chance to see this guy sell and actually cut believable babyface promos, I'd have probably been a big fan of El Generico. Instead, I had to watch him be a mute for 9 years, and it sucked. I did laugh here because the announcers were bringing up some previous story material with Sammy from the previous couple weeks. Apparently, he had wrestled a match with Jack Swagger on television and lost. The now illustrious Jake Hager of AEW fame, where he spent the last 4 years milking Tony Khan's pocketbook dry. Oh, because he was good friends with Jericho. That's when I said, boy, when you're doing jobs to Jake fucking Hager, you might want to reevaluate your career. I don't care what the year is. I guess if I had one gripe about the match, it'd probably be the fact that it went too long. It started to get a little indie toward the end there with all the excessive near falls and kickouts. It'd be one thing if Sammy was in there working with a top guy, but I mean, it's Kurt fucking Hawkins. Do we really need 40 near falls? I don't know. It was funny seeing Hawkins just hit Sammy with a random Death Rider DDT. Sammy just kicks out a 2 like it's nothing. Just totally killed Moxley's finish in a heartbeat. But of course, Sammy makes the valiant comeback. Weirdly enough, he ended up going over with a tornado DDT, which I certainly don't remember that being his finish at the time. I mean, he did try to set up for the haluva kick at one point, but Hawkins booted him in the face to counter it, so I guess he was using the move at the time. We just didn't see it pay off here. I mean, beyond the time limit, it was a fun match. Both of these guys are experienced ring veterans, even though they were in NXT, but it was professionally laid out. It's one thing you'll constantly hear me talk about with NXT going forward. The matches may not always be the cleanest from start to finish, but they're professionally formatted. WWE had agents that were closely working with the guys to make sure they understood timing and pacing and match layout. It wasn't a complete free-for-all like it is with AEW or any other indie promotion on the market today. I'm also not a huge proponent of Sammy's music he was using at the time, but I know it eventually changes. He sort of ends up becoming the guinea pig for fans singing theme music for all the wrestlers. To be fair, his tune was very catchy, unlike a lot of music we hear today, i.e. Seth Rollins. Not even going to go there. So at that point, we move on to an actual TV squash on the program. And boy, when I caught that first glimpse of the job guy they used here, let's just say much laughter was exploited. And I needed a good laugh. Another name I haven't heard mentioned in a while here, Aiden English. It actually took me a minute. During Byron Saxton's intro, I was like, Aiden English. God, that name sounds so familiar, but I can't pick the face out. And then I saw him at the top of the stage during his promo, and I was like, oh yeah, that guy. The one that always looked like a Holocaust victim. He had no body definition or muscle tone. Just a rail-thin, skinny guy. And I even remember thinking that at the time when I watched him. I'm like, man, this guy's a decent athlete. But God, is he so skinny. And he also had a singing gimmick. Oh, God. They weren't all home runs during this time. When do the Vaudevillains debut? Is that still like a year or two out? Because, I don't know how much more I can take of the Aiden English singles push. Especially if it's coming with a lousy a cappella singing. How long does that gimmick last? I was already fed up with him after 20 seconds. This is like go-away heat. But it all paled in comparison to the actual match. Because after Aiden does the whole spotlight singing deal, they turn the house lights back on, and in comes the job guy. And at first I'm looking at him. They got the overhead shot in the building, so it's hard to tell from a distance what his face looked like. Like at first I thought it was Dax Harwood. And then they zoom in. It's fucking QT Marshall. I lost it. I was like, oh, this poor sap. All these years. All these fucking years. He's still nothing more than a generic underneath job guy. How apropos. What was his name here he was using? Did I hear Tom Phillips and Alex Riley refer to him as Michael Q. Laurie? May as well have just called him Tits McGee. God, he was such a geek, they didn't even give him a graphic. The best part is when Tom Phillips says, and I quote, Michael Q. Laurie just simply trying to get himself noticed by management so he can get a shot at the big time. To which, after regaining my composure, I said, yep, sure is. Still trying to this day. He's still trying to win Tony Khan over. And he's got one of those sympathy contracts right now. Oh, this is fabulous. Aiden beat him like a wet sponge. He had a wacky DDT and got the pin in like 2 minutes. What a geek QT was. In 2013, he couldn't even break beyond enhancement level talent for the developmental brand in WWE. Meanwhile, in 2023, Tony Khan had this fucking clown booked all over their flagship show for like 3 years straight. On and off. WWE got the memo early on. AEW is still trying to figure it out. The fact that this guy sucks and always has. Of course, one of the smartest minds in the business I know, and Jim Cornette, took years to figure that out. He seems to have finally caught on board. I guess every blind squirrel finds a nut eventually. So then we had the best thing on the entire show. Better than me ripping into QT Marshall's fucking lame ass. What a trip down memory lane here. God, I could spend hours talking about this one interview segment. Well, for sake of time, I'll give you the highlights. First of all, let's start here. Do you remember who the NXT champion was at this point, without looking it up? Well, I sure did. I'd never forget Bo Dallas. I was a Bo Lever through and through. What a genius gimmick. And they could not have found a better guy to work that role. Bo Dallas is the cheeky, happy-go-lucky, artificial babyface. I can't even remember if he debuted as a babyface. I always just kind of thought he was a heel. All I remember is that by the time I started really following Bo's work in NXT, he was on top of his game. These people hated him. They loathed this fucking phony-ass babyface gimmick. And the great thing is, all Bo had to do was embrace it. The condescending white meat babyface gimmick, it was like, it was so perfectly done. The way Bo delivered everything, that fucking giant creepy grin he would always have on his face. And the great thing with Bo as the NXT champion here is that, if I'm not mistaken, like, I think he was the champion dating all the way back to like April or May of that year. So he had plenty of time to get under the people's skin. giving him that platform to come out every week on television for like 4 or 5 months and put himself over as a defending honorable champion. Meanwhile, everybody knew it was horse shit. Like, I can't stress enough how awesome Bo was. They sorely missed the boat with this guy when they called him up. Big time. They ruined this guy's career. They could have done so much with him. I mean, for Christ's sake, he was Bray Wyatt's fucking brother. How do you miss out on that? Could you imagine the things those guys could have done together on camera? Would have given Bo a chance to actually be an Impact player in WWE before they ran him out of the fucking business. Because they're morons. Still pisses me off to this day. God, Bo was so amazing. Of course, I forgot to mention the interviewer here. Renee Paquette. Yeah, her career certainly didn't change in the last decade. Backstage interviewer for WWE in 2013. Fast forward a year later, she's in AEW doing the same thing. What a stellar career. Of course, this was back when WWE was hiring all the generic beautiful women with robotic personalities. Renee was a rare outcast, though, because she actually sounded and acted like a human being on camera. Plus, she was incredibly gorgeous. Still is. How Moxley ended up with her, I will never know. Low standards. So she actually wound up having a career, as opposed to all the other ones that just sort of fizzled out over time. Anyway, Bo's out there talking about his new hotline that just took off. And Renee's trying to get some insight on the Sammy victory from earlier on, seeing if Bo would consider him a worthy title contender. Of course, Bo's just blowing it off and burying Kurt Hawkins like he's a nobody. He says that if Sammy wants a shot at the gold, he needs to beat some credible challengers, because Kurt Hawkins, I mean, he's a good hand, but he's not necessarily a top guy. I love Bo. And he says that next week he has a special announcement regarding the state of the number one contendership. Just rubbing my hands together for that one. Oh yeah, I'm laying out the groundwork right now. Bo Dallas will be the best thing on this show from here until he leaves NXT. There is no better personality on this show right now. He was incredibly phenomenal. Dare I even say underrated? It's a shame to see what happened to this guy's career now. In the hindsight of 2020, fuck, they dropped the ball with him big time. But just like that, we've arrived at the main event. It is an 8-man tag match with a laundry list of names that brought back some vivid memories. I mean, I could do an hour's worth of backstory breakdown on pretty much everybody involved. But, well, let me first start by talking about everybody in the match, and then we can sort of analyze from there. Brace yourselves here. The match is Tyler Breeze, Leo Kruger, and The Ascension versus Xavier Woods, CJ Parker in the half-trunk, half-tight ring gear, and the NXT Tag Team Champions at the time, Corey Graves and Adrian Neville. And my first set of notes for the segment reads, Tyler Breeze's Twitter handle in 2013 was @gorgeous. Fucking marvelous. Okay, now, let me repeat that again. Tyler Breeze, Leo Kruger, and The Ascension versus Xavier Woods, CJ Parker, Corey Graves, and Adrian Neville. Phew. My God, there's so much to unpack in those 8 names alone. I mean, Tyler Breeze, I've sort of had a love-hate relationship with his material over the years. The stuff he was doing here in NXT at the time, the whole male model gimmick, it was harmless enough. It was a heel shtick, so it worked. The whole pretty boy moniker, like, I could get behind that. Like, eventually I remember they shot the thing where he gets to film his own music video, and that was a pretty big deal at the time. It was pretty legendary. I hated the shit with him and Fandango. Like the fucking Breezango stuff he did in NXT a few years later. That stuff was just trash. Like, it was just overly silly, and the matches were never any good from what I remember. Leo Kruger, I think he ended up becoming Adam Rose a year or so later, right? They did like a total gimmickry package with him. I don't remember a whole lot about him as Leo Kruger in WWE. I mean, I guess the gimmick wasn't getting over, which might explain why they changed it. The Ascension were in an interesting position in NXT. They were sort of like the modern-day Road Warriors for a period of time, and of course they got called up to the main roster, and the rest is history. I mean, if I remember, those guys got run out of the company before not too long. And then he got the babyface team, which, holy cow, seeing Juice Robinson when he was CJ Parker, I had totally forgotten about this gimmick. Wow. What even in the hell was the gimmick? The weird psychedelic hippie gimmick with the goofy 70s look? What, were they trying to go for some knockoff Mike Awesome shtick? I mean, I seem to recall it failing pretty epically. In fact, it was so bad that Parker had to leave WWE, go to Japan, get himself over again with a complete different name, and then wind up back in the States years after the fact, once the people forgot the NXT run. But did they really? Well, some of them may have. And to think this same guy would wind up on AEW with Jay White and FTR, having what might amount to be the best tag team match in the modern era. Fucking hell. It is so surreal going back and seeing this stuff again. And then you got Corey Graves and Adrian Neville as the NXT Tag Champions, which I don't remember at all. I mean, obviously Neville would wind up becoming Pac once he left WWE several years later. I actually think he was using that on the indie circuit before WWE even signed him, because he was around well beforehand. And he's still wrestling. It's crazy, especially for the kind of style he works. He's always been a physical specimen. You know, the people with whom he associates on television, that's questionable. But he definitely has a great look. I wish AEW would have done more with him when they signed him several years ago. Could have been such a bigger deal than he wound up being. I mean, they went from having him beat Kenny Omega on pay-per-view to having terrible throwaway trios matches with the Lucha fucks on TV. Now he's just a background player on that show. And then there's Corey Graves, who I've always been pretty open about how much I hate his WWE commentary. And again, I know he had the concussion problems that forced him into retirement. But even so, looking back when he was a full-time wrestler in NXT, I'm sorry, I just didn't get it. I didn't get the gimmick. I didn't get the look. I didn't get the whole aura. He just never really did anything for me, I guess. But of course, he was guaranteed a job for life because of the abrupt retirement, so they had to give him something to work with, I guess. Man, what a weird cast of personalities And they still had about 20 minutes left of airtime when they rang the bell for this match. I mean, I figured it was going to go a while. And again, the stark contrast between what we see in multi-mans today versus how things used to be, even 10 years ago. Even in a circumstance like this, you got all these guys out there. It's constant back and forth tags. It's not just a wild card free-for-all. People are tagging in and out legally. Nobody's allowed to stay in the ring past the 5 count. There's 2 guys in the ring at a given time for the most part. Crazy to think, but it's almost like you can do multi-man tag matches and still follow the rules of tag team wrestling. What a novel concept. You know, even in a match like this where you got 8 distinguishable personalities on camera, Christ, look at the heels. They had a pretty boy, 2 monster powerhouses, and a weird off-kilter manhunter. But it still worked. They did the big dive sequence spot with all the baby faces leading to the second commercial break. Came back with the heels working over the baby faces again for a little bit. I did think it was funny how the fans popped when Breeze finally tagged in for the first time, only to tag back out as soon as Xavier caught him with a punch to the gut. It's kind of the story they had in the match here with Breeze, because he was doing the model Rick Martel gimmick. Like anytime somebody would throw a punch or mess up his hair, he would immediately tag back out to make sure no one fucked with his good looks. I mean, it's absurd if you think about it for more than 2 seconds, but I mean, whatever. He's a heel. It works. Of course, the crowd was baby-facing him, which didn't help. It's the problem, too. You got a lot of hardcore fans in the crowd, so character dynamic was a little bit fucked up. But the match builds to the babyface comeback. CJ gets the hot tag and starts running wild. And they eventually do the breakdown sequence where one guy feeds the other, and they kind of do that back and forth between both teams. There were some sloppy things at the end where guys weren't in the right position to take bumps and things didn't really click. Corey screwed up a clothesline spot to Leo out to the floor where they were supposed to do the double bump over the top rope, but it didn't work. Corey just ended up sort of eating shit on the landing and made himself look stupid. But they actually ended up doing this really great finish with Tyler Breeze. By the way, small nitpick here. I call it out every time I see it. Tyler did a back slap tag to one of the Ascension members, and the ref allowed it. Like, Dusty was working with these guys at the time as an agent, so I'm hoping he was smart enough to call Tyler out on that. Because I hate that shit. It always bugs me. And everybody does it nowadays. I've just become so jaded and cynical about it. But even the guys who were doing it back then. But Tyler gets a near fall on CJ. And, well, I think the story here was that the heels were sort of sick of Breeze's bullshit. Like, he spent the entire match on the apron and kept doing blind tags whenever he saw the babyfaces were vulnerable. So at the point CJ kicked out, the heels all just abandoned Breeze and left him high and dry. So they did the finish where all the babyfaces got to hit their finish on Breeze. A little bit of a comeuppance angle, I guess. I liked it. You know, Neville hit the red arrow corkscrew on Breeze for the pin. And I'll say this. I'm the first guy on the internet to complain about how constant gymnastic spots in wrestling just completely take me out of matches. But when Pac used to hit that red arrow finish in WWE, that move was fucking awesome. And they were smart enough to establish it's the guy's finisher. No one's going to kick out of it. If he hits the move, game over. And it was so visually cool looking. You know, the problem is you watch it now and you're like, yeah, well, everybody else does shit that's like 10 times more impressive than that. Like, how does it really hold up years later? But the match was all right for what it was. I mean, I think I spent more time talking about the personalities involved in the actual match, but the action was good. And kind of got the chance to give you a brief overview of the talent pool they had to work with at the time. at least when it comes to a lot of the top guys. You know, the problem is it's really kind of sad when you look back at the people involved here and you realize out of every single talent in this match, the only two that are still with WWE today, Xavier and Corey. And even in that case, Corey's retired as a wrestler. So really, if you think about it, the only one left standing as a full-time wrestler is Xavier. And this guy was around for years before coming to WWE. God, I still remember when he was Consequences Creed in TNA. That's going back like 5 years prior to that. But really think about that for a minute. Tyler Breeze, no longer working for the company. Leo Kruger, no longer working for the company. The Ascension, both team members, no longer with the company. CJ Parker, Juice Robinson, no longer with the company. Adrian Neville, Pac, no longer with the company. This was the golden list of talent at the time. Like, these were the guys that were in the higher pecking order creatively for NXT. And 6 out of the 8 guys no longer employed. That's, well, it says a lot of things. But in a situation like that, who do you blame? Do you blame management for not giving these guys a proper main roster showcase? Is some of it on the boys for not making the most out of their opportunities? Kind of goes both ways, I guess. I mean, I don't remember reading stories about these guys having run-ins with management. At least nothing's coming to mind. But it's so strange when you think about NXT during this period. This was supposed to be the next class of top guys that they were grooming for major success on the main roster. And a lot of it never came to be. And again, some of it was booking. Some of it was guys getting saddled with rotten gimmicks. And there's plenty more of those to come. But it's kind of the cold, hard reality. A lot of these guys just floundered without the NXT model backing them. You take them out of Hunter's supervision. You put them solely in the hands of Vince McMahon. Well, we saw what happened. Including the current reigning NXT champion, Bo Dallas. Very, very sad. But that's why we're here to take the journey. To remember the good times. And the bad times. And the ugly times. And there's a whole lot of good, bad, and ugly, let me tell you. It's definitely growing pains. I think one thing that will become abundantly clear with NXT is that it took them a while to find their footing. But I remember a lot of the stuff that happens a couple years out from now, and there was certainly some growth. A lot of growth, in fact. Like I said, it took them a while to get there, but they eventually did it. They became the hot must-see product. And to see from where they started to where they went to, I mean, there's a lot to unpack in just this 2 or 3 or 4 year window. But for our first deep dive, the show is very eye-opening. I mean, just a 40-minute program, and we're only really scratching the surface of the discussions. Just wait until the TakeOver era. I mean, right now, NXT is a puppy with big paws. Compared to where they would wind up just 5 or 6 months later, in the lead up to WrestleMania 30. It was right around the point Bryan Danielson's popularity started to take off. Wow. You know what's funny? It's like, this all happened, 9-ish years ago? the whole Bryan Danielson lead up to WrestleMania, the hardcores hijacking Raw and forcing WWE's hand. Meanwhile, you got this NXT model underneath of it, and you could see WWE sort of going through the indie circuit and trying to find the most valuable talent they could get their hands on, the ones that they could make big stars out of. Kind of started with Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn and worked its way up from there. I think Samoa Joe comes in pretty soon. Talked about Balor. He's not too far off from now. Nakamura's going to show up pretty soon. There's a lot of stuff that happens. There really is. And I hope you all take this journey with me because we have much more to discuss. Until next time. Cool. So thanks everybody for watching. Again, make sure you subscribe, comment, like the show, and make sure you come back to check out the Friday podcast. More classic wrestling in the works. And again, I'll reiterate what I said a while ago. If the AEW model was your thing and you liked hearing me come on here and rant about how shitty that show was, well, sorry, not sorry. I'm kind of at the point now where I'm just going to let that show dwindle. It is what it is. I'm sort of hands off at this point. CM Punk was the only reason worth going to watch that show for me. So you remove him from the equation, and what else is there for me to sink my teeth into? They made MJF into a joke. FTR are sort of non-factors on that program right now. There's just not enough to entice me. Not enough to hook my interest. And again, with CM Punk gone, the message that I've received from Tony Khan is that if you were somebody that was an advocate of the real professional wrestling product, well, you're no longer going to get it. To which I say, all right then. Message received. You just carry on. You let the inmates continue to run the asylum and see where it gets you. So, all signs pointing up for the FSWR channel going forward. And catch you guys on the flip side. Thanks for watching. Peace out.